Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm your host, Danielle Richardson. And if you are enjoying the podcast, enjoying these stories, listening to people around the world, great way to support the podcast is just by subscribing and sharing if you enjoy the story or commenting below. But today, I'm very honored and just I think it's really neat to me that I'm getting to speak with Laura Whitehorn. Um, and many of you, if you Google her or don't know who she is, maybe the younger generation doesn't, I'm not sure, of my audience. She was actually part of the Weatherman group for a while, the Weatherman Underground, which was basically, I'll have her explain it more, but it was basically the heart of it was an anti-war movement. Um, And she was actually involved in the 1983 U.S. Senate building bombing. Um, and she's been a civil rights advocate. Right now, she works for, um, I want to make sure I'm saying it right. It's RAPP, right?
Release aging people in prison. I'm wearing
Yeah.
a shirt, but it's done pretty wild, so you can't see it. But it's Release Aging People in Prison, RAPP campaign, RAPP.
Yes. She's a co-founder of that, and then she volunteers now as well. Um, and she, she has a very extensive history. She was in prison for 14 years. And so I really wanted to just hear her story and get to hear her perspective. And I thought it would be something that would be interesting to listeners as well as something I would like to learn more about. So, Laura, I'm so grateful. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It'll be an interesting conversation.
So, Laura, I mean, I maybe am ignorant. I don't know. I didn't know what the Weatherman was. Like, I had never heard of that until a couple months ago. Um, so I wanted to ask you, in your own words, what do you think? How would you describe that? Because I know you're a part of a lot of different advocacy groups. It wasn't just the Weatherman. And over your history of your time, you've been in several different types of organizations for different causes and reasons. Um, But in your own words, what was that organization about?
Yeah. Well, and Weatherman was a tiny little piece of my life,
Yeah.
but and it was it called itself a revolutionary anti-imperialist organization. And by that we meant revolutionary meant that we thought that there were things wrong with American society that were fundamental, and that in some fashion that had to change fundamentally, not just a tweak here and there. We felt that, and I still believe this, that the US system is, first of all, it's capitalist, which is a very competitive and non-caring system that's about profits and not people, but more deeply, that this country was built on stolen land from the genocide, attempted genocide, but it was genocide, even though there are still indigenous people and they are fighting, have been fighting for centuries, but it was their land. It was taken, there was part of Mexico that was also a different indigenous people's land, the Southwest that was taken. There was Louisiana, there were all the pieces of this, of the landmass that's called the United States were stolen through settler colonialism, which was Europeans, white Europeans coming over and stealing what belonged to and what was part of the history and culture of indigenous people who were not European and white. And then the forced importing of Africans as slave labor, and that period in the United States history was where the wealth was accumulated that then allowed capitalism to flourish. And you could read W.E.B. Du Bois' History of Slavery, or there are many that analyze the ways in which economically and socially the forced, unpaid brutalized labor of Africans who were brought from other cultures and forced to leave their culture, I mean, in chains across so the
Yeah.
brutality of slavery. Okay, so that was the basis of this country. And what we were seeing in when I was when I was coming of age, I guess, was the war in Vietnam, but also invasions and wars around the world that the United States was conducting. That meant that the entire basis of all of our privileges, our refrigerators, which when I was a kid, not everyone had a refrigerator at first, not everyone had a TV. That kind of thing was just exploding. That was all being done at the cost of the blood and labor and theft of culture of third world people around the world and inside the United States. And so Weatherman it was the name came from, I know people probably are seeing, I haven't seen it yet, but the new movie about Dylan, uh, No Direction Home or whatever it's called. He wrote a song, You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows. And
Mm.
so the name of the organization came from that. And I think that, during the war in Vietnam, we really saw, you know, you weren't alive then, but when we saw the United States burning by napalm, by dropping napalm, which is an incendiary chemical which attaches to the body. And you could see little children running, screaming on fire that was being caused by our government. We felt that really, really strong response was needed. So there was a couple of bombings which were very carefully done, not to hurt anyone, but to be property damage. Um, and they were to point out institutions that are institutions of war, but they were also to say, this is what's going on is violence, that this country's policies, which people can talk about as, should it be this many millions of dollars that are sent for arms or this many, that every one of those dollars means a life or death. And we're seeing that now with the United States funding, supporting Israel committing genocide against the Palestinian people. So that's the through line. And then underneath that is that inside, I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, and Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Brooklyn. And that was the North. It
Yeah.
wasn't the South where when I was in high school and college, Black people weren't permitted to vote. They were permitted to vote in the North, but there was de facto segregation of the schools. And we see it still to this day in the disparities between the family wealth of white people and Black people in this country. Black people's family wealth inherited over generations amounts to some tiny, tiny percentage of white people's. And so that is all when I was in high school, and I just, as I don't know, I was brought up to think everyone deserves equal human rights. So I thought, why is it that Black people in the South aren't being permitted to vote? That my elementary school, which was almost all white, had new textbooks and classrooms with windows that work. And within walking distance of my house was a school that was primarily in a primarily Black neighborhood that had broken windows. I could see from the kids that I knew who went there, the textbooks they had were hand-me-downs with other kids' names written in them and history that was already out of date then. Anyway, so I saw all these injustices,
Mm.
and my father used to tell me, well, and my mother, well, we need white people to be educated about to be anti-racist. But what I perceived when the Black Power movement started, or didn't start, but erupted in the 60s, was that racism was a system based on power relationships, that Black people were kept out of power. And not allowing people to vote was one tiny part of that. It was everywhere. And so that was the motivating through line in my life, whatever organization I felt could organize. And then also in the 60s, there was the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, which was started in the South because it was helping Black people vote, which was going up against the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not sure if you know the case where there was in 1964, there was something called Freedom Summer, which took busloads of Northern college students, white college students, but also Black, down to the South to work with SNCC to register people to vote. And if you want, there are many documentaries about that period. And the latest is something about has Lowndes County in the title, and it's very important history to know. That's within my lifetime. I mean,
Yeah.
I was in college then, so it's not like it was when I was 2 years old. So that's our recent history. And at one point, SNCC decided that they wanted white people to form a separate organization to organize in the white community to try to turn white people into allies of democratic rights for Black people, rather than going into the Black community and thinking that they were going to organize Black people. And so we took a sort of a lesson from that and said, yes, racism is a white, if it's a social and educational and political problem of thinking, then that's a problem that exists in the white community, not in the Black community. And so we started doing solidarity organizations. And the last thing I want to say, I know I'm answering a very long for a short question, but um, I think it's very important for people to understand solidarity. I'm not saying I have the answer to it, but to me, solidarity is looking at a situation, seeing who is affected by it, listening to their voices, listening to their strategies. But it's also a strategic concept. If we, for example, release aging people in prison, our goal is to dismantle the racist punishment system, to say that the kind of punishments that are handed out, especially to Black and Brown people, are lifelong punishment and re-enslavement and civic death, where incarcerated people are not permitted to have the human rights that people outside have. And that even within the prison population, there are divisions by the state of the people who have what are considered violent crimes and what are considered low-level crimes. And that all of those divisions need to be broken down. And we act in solidarity with people working on other struggles and other issues in New York State, where we're located, and elsewhere. And we do that because we understand that there is no such thing as solving the deep problems of injustice that exist in this country in isolation. You can't solve one and then not care about the, you can't fight for the rights of people who are unhoused to have housing, but ignore the problems of people who are incarcerated, who are going to get out and also have no housing. You have to look at all those issues together. And that ultimately, since the power lies in a class system and in a group of billionaires, as we know now, we have to fight together to upend that system, or none of the individual issues will ever be solved. So that was what Weatherman was. That's what all the organizations that I've been part of, I hope, have been about.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking going back to when you were talking about when you were in school and seeing the disparity between your school and the black school. Um, do you think that was the first time that you became aware or a passion was ignited in you to fix this or do something about it? Or was there something before, even when you were younger, that you were like, it changed your perspective, that you were like, I have to do something to fix this?
No, I think it was, I mean, I was only in fourth grade then, so I was pretty young. Um, I was in a grade ahead for my age, so I was probably, I don't know, not even 13 yet. And it was my first real awareness, although I had been aware of the Red Scare and the anti-communist movement because my family was affected by it. And that was, I think, a few years before that. So when I was born in 1945. It was just at the end of World War II. It was at the birth of the United Nations. So the whole concept of human rights as as a body of law and practice that should inform every government around the world on the treatment of human beings was kind of in the air. And I was, an idealistic little kid. And like most kids, I hated things that weren't fair. If I saw something that wasn't fair, it just bugged me. And the first thing I thought about the difference in the schools was, that's not fair. Why, why should a kid, because they're black, have a worse school than I have? It just didn't, it offended my sense of what the natural order should be. Um, so, I was totally naive, of course, to think that there was that was like gonna govern the world, but that was what started it. And then the discovery of the system of power came around also I think because there were so many issues facing society right at the same moment. There was the issue of voters' rights among Black people. And oh, I know I started this before. I said Freedom Summer when people went down. Um, Two young men from my town and one young Black man were killed by the Klan viciously. And it was a very famous case and very famous. It was Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney and oh God, can't remember the name of the third one right this second. And it was just so shocking because they were they were brutally kidnapped and killed for trying to register people to vote. And so that sort of violence, there had been lynchings
Yeah.
for years, but a lot of that hadn't, entered sort of the kinds of newspapers and news that I read and have I found out later, and I was a kid. I wasn't and there was no internet, there was no access. You had to go to the library and ask the librarian for old books full of old newspapers. It was even before microfiche. You had to look at everything. So it was a different kind of a sense. And part of the thing about the war in Vietnam is that it was the first time we had seen on television what our government was doing to people around the world.
Yeah. I find it fascinating that a fourth grader would take notice of that because, I mean, I don't want to make a blanket statement about young people today, but I mean, I think a lot of us are very consumed with what's going on with us. Obviously, there's a lot of mental health struggles. There's a lot of things that young people are facing now that are really rough, but it's a very inward focused age. So I'm very surprised. It just surprises me how much you cared about world events at such a young age. Um, do you think did your parents foster a more outward glance on the world? Because I just I haven't met any kids, I don't think, or at least teenagers even, where they're looking out. It's very much an inward age. And so I think it's amazing that you had um, that heart of seeing the unfairness in the world and wanting to do something about it. Do you think, did your parents foster that at all, or that just happened upon seeing things?
No, they did. I mean, my grandfather, who died way before I was born, was part of the Socialist Party. Um, you know, there had been, I mean, people don't remember this because the Red Scare wiped it out, but there was a huge following for the Communist Party in the 40s, 30s, 40s. And I think a lot of my parents' friends were in the party. And so there were political discussions at the dinner table. And
Mm.
my father was very strict. You know, you had to be at the dinner table. There was no watching television. And we didn't even have a television until I think I was in sixth grade. And then it was very monitored. I mean, there was one TV and my parents decided what we could watch. So yeah, there was some of that, but I also think that there are a lot of people who are moved by what's going on in the world. I also think that the way that there have been, I mean, I am not a conspiracy theorist at all, but if you look at the development of capitalist culture, you would think there was a conspiracy because all of the goods and services that are available to us now that weren't when I was a kid mean that people's lives are more atomized. They're not, I mean, we didn't have video games or anything like that. The only thing you could do by yourself was read a book, or if you had a TV, watch TV or listen to the radio. We would listen to sports on the radio. That was, my sister and I were huge Dodger fans. And when the Dodgers got moved out of Brooklyn, we thought our lives were over. And, it was very important to us in the same way, I think now that things are important to kids. That's always true. And of course, you're there with your own feelings, your own body, your own challenges, relating to other people and going to school. But um, I think that, yeah, I remember my father saying, if you don't care about the world beyond you, then you're living a very narrow existence, very narrow life. But I think it's not as unusual as we think it is. It's just that maybe there aren't places where people can get to. I mean, look at the the outpouring in the movement for of solidarity with the Palestinian people over the last 2 years has been huge, and people from every walk of life and young people, a lot of high schools,
Yeah,
colleges,
colleges.
but
Yeah.
not just colleges, high schools, grade schools. So I think that it's definitely in the interest of, I guess, the rulers, if you want to call them that, the government, to keep people from knowing too much and from being interested. But I think it's a natural reaction to be to want to reach out to other people and want to care about them. I mean, and in release aging people in prison, because we work in within the prison system and with family members, we see that all the time where people in their worst moments, they're thrown in prison. They're going to do in New York State, a a you can have a sentence that's longer than your life easily. We call them virtual life sentences, death by incarceration. Someone can have one of our members who was able to win release on clemency and parole had he was arrested like in his late 20s, I think, and he had a sentence of 65 years to life, which meant that in 65 years from the date that he was arrested, he would have been able to go to the parole board to ask for release. But at that point, the parole board was not letting anyone out, which is part of our work, is to try to change the parole process so that people are valued for who they are now, not the crime that they did, which some people, as I'm sure you know, there are many cases of people who didn't do the crime that they're arrested for, but whether they did or not, they've changed over the years. And the fact that they should be kept in prison based on something they did when they were 20 and now they're 60, It defies all kinds of logic, but it also defies the values that we think our society works on, treat other people as you would want to be treated, see the good in people, not just the bad, all that. But the systems that are in place in this country don't do that. So, that's what I think is important about over the years, the different movements that have sprung up have mostly been trying to fight for basic human values, basic human rights that would exist if there weren't the economic and social systems that have driven them away. So all the things you're talking about, all those individual, I mean, Apple comes out with a new iPhone every 5 minutes, and then you have to get it. And I know my phone, if I'm taking a walk and my phone starts beeping with something from WhatsApp or Twitter or something, you can very easily get lost in that little space between you and the world that is an electronic connection. It's not a real connection. So
Yeah.
I think that's what you're talking about. I mean, yeah.
I mean, I definitely agree with you, in the little that I've researched and little that I do know about prisons, I definitely think there are reforms that are needed, and obviously there are several prison reform organizations. I think what hits me and what's hard for me is I definitely agree with you that someone can change and become a different person over however many years. Um, I think what's hard is when I think about like if you take a murder for instance, right? Someone commits a murder when they're 20 for, whatever. They get 65 to life and they change. They're very sorry. They're repentant. They never would have done that again. But the victim's family, I mean, that person's never coming back. That person's gone forever. Um, and that's where it hits me hard of just even though, yeah, I know you're sorry and that definitely makes sense. I mean, thank you for the apology, but at the same time, someone's life has just been obliterated off the face of the earth forever. And that's harder for me to go, okay, well, it's been, a long time. Maybe you should come out now. You're different. It just, that seems unfair to me.
Mhm. I understand that. I mean, and I think one of the things that, RAPP is made up and led by formerly incarcerated people, many of whom did have those serious crimes with victims. Keeping someone in prison and destroying them doesn't bring the person back. What the people that are the heart of RAPP led programs in prison about accountability as opposed to punishment. Victims' families came in and met with them. They talked about what would constitute healing, what would constitute, nothing can bring the person back. There is no way that you can do that, but neither can prisons. And, so for many years, the justification for prisons was to stop people from committing crimes. Well, if prisons stopped people from committing crimes, this would be the safest crime-free country in the world because we
Right.
have the most, and it's not. It's actually has no correlation between incarceration um, and crime levels, crime rates. And in fact, we have for RAPP, we have a number of victims' rights organizations that support our initiatives, one of which is that parole should be granted for people unless the board thinks that they are still that same person or still doing the same things they did. And there are many ways of knowing that when someone's been, under a microscope in prison for 40 years. And the other one is that once people turn 55, they should have, if they've done already 15 years, they should have a chance to go before the board. There shouldn't be life without parole with, that's it, lock them up and throw away the key. But the other larger question is because if the pain of someone who's lost a loved one should be the the standard by which punishment is meted out, then we're back to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and who is it who famously said the whole world would be blind? Um, so vengeance creates more vengeance, more anger, more violence. The system of prisons, and in New York State, we're living through this now because there have been two cases in the last few months of incarcerated men who were killed by correctional officers purposely, chained up. I mean, one of them was caught on video by mistake. The guards didn't know that the cameras were on. They had turned their body cameras off. They handcuffed him. He was shackled to a chair and they beat him to death. And it was because the video caught it, this one case came to light. I know other cases like that. I have friends who were beaten and then charged with assault because once you're in that prison,
Right.
no one knows. So the whole system is not set up for forgiveness and to bring the kind of peace that would come with knowing that there has been some form of healing. The state doesn't offer victim services that are worth a damn. Most people who've lost a loved one are asked by the prosecutor in New York State, do they want to testify? Do they want to make statements saying, lock this person up forever? If they don't, they're thrown away. They're never contacted again with, do you need therapy? Do you need, so it's not really about that, the way the system works now. And we do need accountability systems that bring some kind of healing to people. I mean, I've sat in court with people who are trying to get out after many years, after 45, 50 years. And someone from the family of the person who was murdered comes to court, and you can see on their face they have no peace. They have had no healing. Locking the person up, even before they had a chance of release, gave them no peace. So, I understand what you're saying. And of course, the first, your first, uh, your first feeling when someone hurts you is you want to hurt them back. But as a society, if that's the system we put in place, we will never have health. We will never have public health. We know what anger and rage and vengeance, those feelings of vengeance, do to people's physical health too. So I guess, it's not a full answer because there is no way to say this makes it okay. It's okay now. It's been 40 years. It's okay. Don't miss the person. I mean, I still miss people that I lost when I was young. You do. But whether punishment is the answer or whether we need a different kind of system that is not based on enmity, that is based on something more like really human solidarity. And I can tell you, I've had situations where I was wronged by someone. And forgiving after we go through a process, forgiveness is one of the most wonderful feelings I have ever had of forgiving someone. And I'm not sure why. All I can say is it's like love on steroids. It's like joy and love mixed together because you feel as if you're building something different
Yeah.
among. So, you're not old enough to know I do. There are people in my generation who I'll say to them, oh, so-and-so's coming to town. And they'll say, oh, in 1972, she wouldn't let me come into a meeting because, something. And I'm like, does that do anything for you? Does that make you happy?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not a full answer, but given where we're at, We still have the death penalty in this country. Ridiculous. I don't know if you follow Sister Helen Prejean, but she's a Catholic nun who became an activist against the death penalty. And the depth of her soul that appears in her work has organized so many people to have peace and joy in their lives instead of anger and hatred. It's pretty amazing. So I know that's a very long answer about it, but we really, and the other thing is, of course, for us, it's rebuilding families, because if your family is destroyed, then you can't sustain life very well. And what I saw in prison, because I was in with women, and they were mostly Black women, Mexican women, Latino women, women of color, is that their families, their kids suffered for it. So the person's in prison and their family is suffering for it. So now you have a murder. The family of the person who was murdered suffers a lot of trauma and uh, destruction. And now the family of the person who's in prison who didn't commit the murder are also suffering that. So in the end, the social fabric is not benefiting from this.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because I mean, I know you've been in prison. You were in prison for 14 years, which is a long time. Um, what was that experience like for you? Like, how did it change the way you saw people and the world?
Hmm. Well, I had already been a political activist for many years and had worked with the people in the Black liberation struggle, the Puerto Rican independence struggle, Native American struggle. We had talked about prison, and I had gone to jail numerous times for civil disobedience or just for being in a demonstration that the cops decided they wanted to arrest people. But that was short term. And this was living in a different society from, I'm a middle class white woman. So uh, my friends are from all different classes and races, but where I live, when my expectations of how I'm going to be treated and what I can do, is very much different from a Black woman of my same, absolutely everything the same. I'm going to get better treatment than she is, just off the bat. So in prison, it kind of it underlined all my values. It underlined my sense of the importance of human solidarity because, when I came into the prison, I was being called a terrorist and, all this stuff in the newspapers. And the women I was in with reached out to me immediately, didn't believe that because they knew about the lies that were being told about them. So, um, and the solidarity that I experienced from the beginning was amazing. But then I really saw the damage that was being done to them and their families. So over the years I was in prison, I realized the women I was in with were mostly in their childbearing years, between some as young as 18, but mostly between like 20 and 40. And that meant that they weren't going to be able to have children, or if they already had children, they weren't going to be able to raise them. The kids very often were sent to foster care or to, one woman told me, oh my God, my father who abused me or my uncle who abused me is now raising my daughter. Oh my God, what's happening to her? So the destruction of the ability to create the next generation, which is one of the UN definitions of genocide from the Declaration of Human Rights, the destruction in whole or in part of the ability of a people to produce the next generation was going on in the name of law and order and public safety. Now, over time, if we want to talk about public safety, which is supposedly what prisons are for, they're destroying exactly the safety that they're supposed to be there to preserve. So that was one thing I saw, and then personally for me, hearing, well, I was in federal prison, so women were, I did a lot of my time in California. My family's in New York. Um, and there were I was in with a lot of women from DC because at that point there was no federal holding place in DC. So all the DC women with charges that were more than a year got sent to the federal. So they were in California. Their families were in DC. They were one of the wage earners in their family. So now the family has less money. The kids are without their mother, and they can't even visit because it's so expensive. And then I would hear on the phone a woman wailing because whoever was the caretaker for the children or her mother or someone was telling her that her child had been hurt or had run away or something. And that sense of, I mean, what's the name of your podcast? It's,
Oh, Lament of Hope.
yeah. When I saw the name Lament, I thought that's what it sounded like a wailing lament. I can't protect my child, whom I love so much. And so I experienced all that. And I also experienced when I went, and I was going to say this before, when I was first arrested, I was in Baltimore City Jail, which, has now been torn down and changed. So was DC jail. But when I was there, it was the poorest. There were bars on the windows, but no glass. So we had to put trash bags over the windows in the winter. It was freezing. There was no hot water. There was no, I mean, it was just a total disaster. And the first night I was there, people brought me food, shared their shower shoes with me so I could take a shower. I was in isolation. And that sense of solidarity was something I experienced and that we built all through the years in prison. I had some very, very dear friends, one of whom right now we're in touch all the time, others in less constant touch, but, you know, friendships are formed and the ability of people to laugh and to have lives despite being in horrible, horrible situations where they're really alone at night, might be crying, was really stirring and really great. But I
Yeah.
did come out dedicated to I'm going to do everything I can to upend this system because this is cruelty. And a lot of people don't even know. There were people, who don't know that there's a prison in their town. They have no idea what's going on there. So prisons take suffering and put it out of the sight lines of people who might really not like the idea that there's all that suffering going on in their backyard.
Yeah. What I know you mentioned the cold, you mentioned the lack of even just sanitary things that you would need in the Baltimore prison. And then in the California prison, obviously there was the emotional hardship of being so far away from your family and seeing how it would affect other people as well in the prison. Um, what do you think made the biggest impression on you in the hardest way when you were in California, in the federal prison in California, because that's where you were the longest? What happened, whether it be a scenario or something someone said to you or something you witnessed or was done to you that solidified in your mind what it was like to be in jail?
Well, one thing, okay, I'm going to say a negative and a positive. The negative is that you're pat searched all the time, coming out of the kitchen after a meal. You're pat searched by men. And as a lesbian and as a woman, that felt so invasive and humiliating and infuriating to me. And I had to go through it. If I ate in the dining room 3 times a day, I had to go through it 3 times a day. And after a while, I would really avoid going to the dining room if I could somehow cobble together with friends enough food from commissary to avoid that. But I think the main thing was what I said before about hearing women on the phone. Uh, or this one situation, I got a lot of visitors because I want to talk about this for a minute too. I was a political prisoner. Um, but most women didn't get a lot of visits unless they lived right in the Bay Area. If they were from there, they could. I had a friend whose sister was raising her own children and my friend's children, and she moved to California from, where was she from originally? Louisiana, to be able so that the kids could see their mother
Hmm.
weekends, which was amazing. But there was this friend of mine from DC who was so excited because her kids were finally going to visit her. She'd been locked up for 7 years, 8 years, and for the first time, her mother had saved enough money to fly the family out there. Can you imagine how much that cost? Um, with these two children and come visit her and her grandmother. And they got turned away from visiting because her grandmother, who was in a wheelchair, was wearing culottes. Do you remember what those are? It's a divided skirt. It's as long as this,
Oh,
but instead of, and there was a rule in the federal prison system that came out of men's prisons that you couldn't wear shorts in a visit. Well, these weren't shorts, but they were a separated skirt. The woman was 80 years old in a wheelchair, and the family was not permitted to come in. So they rushed to a shopping center nearby and bought her a different thing. And by the time they got back, they were told it was too late to get in for visiting. And the just internalized fury and rage and sorrow of my friend, I'll never forget. The upside was that this was a period of time when there were many, many, many political prisoners from the Black Liberation Movement, the anti-imperialist movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement. And in California, because were even fewer than there are now, federal prisons for women of maximum security, which of course, because we were terrorists, we needed. There were 6 of us in that prison, 4 from the Puerto Rican independence movement, 7 of us actually, and then 3 of us from our case, the resistance conspiracy case. And so we had the ability to send out messages of solidarity to demonstrations that were happening. We had the ability sometimes to have, we weren't allowed to cross visit, but we managed anyway. So when the wonderful, wonderful Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez from New York came to visit the Puerto Rican independence prisoners, she was able to visit also with me and Marilyn Buck and Linda Evans from a case. So we were all, and when Kwame Ture who came to visit, he was able to say, we have a picture with him. So, there were those moments, and even more than that, we used to like make little parties among us, we would talk about what was going on in the world. And of course, with other incarcerated women who were politically conscious. So one of the people I'm still very good friends with from that time, an African American woman who is a Muslim, and she was the head of the Islamic um, group in that prison, and we used to have amazing times together in political times. So I think that was some of it, the depth of the sexual abuse of all incarcerated people, but particularly to women and non-binary people, and of course now trans people, was truly uh, blood curdling to see. I mean, this is the United States government having their agents molest women on a daily basis. And a lot of the women had been sexually abused. At some point, someone did a study, 80% of incarcerated women have been sexually abused. And just the last thing I'll say is that and I had this one situation in a different prison where this man who was a guard who hated me. He was actually in the Ku Klux Klan. This is in Lexington. And he purposely grabbed my breasts when he was pat searching me. And I automatically elbowed him really hard. Now, if I had been on the street, I would have done more than that, but I wasn't taking that. And I risked an automatic 5-year sentence for that, for assaulting a guard. But luckily for me, there was a Black woman lieutenant at the prison who understood who this guy was and understood what was going on. And I found out later, she had championed other women who felt they were molested by guards. And she absolutely tore up the charge for me.
Yeah.
Otherwise, anyway, so my point about that is just that the self-defense of your body and your dignity, which you would do on the street. I mean, women take classes in self-defense to to fight back if they're raped, right? If there's someone's threat. You're
Yeah.
allowed to do that. In prison, any self-defense of your body or dignity means that you have assaulted a prison guard. And we're dealing with cases in New York where people who were about to get out of prison are thrown back, are kept in because they defended themselves against the kinds of attacks that are going on right now in the New York State system. So those are some of the things. There's a lot more that I could talk about.
I
And there's,
mean,
yeah,
I was gonna say what um when you were talking about the sexual aspect of attacks, what I know you mentioned the one that happened to you, which of course is terrible, and I'm very sorry. Um, but do you have any other stories that you could share, either of yourself or of women, that demonstrate that powerlessness that
yeah,
is felt?
yep. At the same time, right? Okay, so right now in New York State, and I hope people who are on this, I hope you will put somewhere our our website, rappcampaign.com, RAPP campaign.com, because we have a lot of information there about what goes on in the New York State system. And right now, what happened was that after the first of the men that I was talking about was killed by guards and the video came out, the guards were furious and they went on strike supposedly over working conditions, but really to try to cover up for that happening. And at the same time, there was an exposure of the fact that Governor Hochul, had promoted to the superintendent of the prison where the murder happened because she had to remove the warden from that prison. A man named Thorpe, I think, who was a long time DOCS, which is Department of Corrections and Community Supervision in New York, um, a guard who had come up through the ranks, who is charged with, because he did it, raping women in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is the maximum security prison for women in New York State. And I know some of the women, and I know what happened. It's not like they charged him, and their cases
Sure.
were in court at the same time as Hochul promoted him. And so that's not only shows what goes on, but how much it doesn't matter to the system. They're like fine with that. She knows those cases are in court. She knows that he's charged with that. And, she was a big champion of, women's rights, and we should have an equal protection amendment in New York State and the Me Too movement and everything. And then she promotes, because once you're in prison, you're not a human being anymore. So it doesn't matter. So I do know of those, and I know other situations because RAPP, our staff is made up largely of formerly incarcerated women and men and non-binary people and family members of people who are in prison. And so the formerly incarcerated women from New York State that I work with have told me these stories, and I know they're true. And in the US prisons, we're strip searched all the time. And in the federal system and state, it's supposed to be that you're strip searched by someone of the same gender as you. But there also are exceptions to that. And even being strip searched by, what's the difference? You're standing in a room naked with someone who has all their clothes on and can hurt you. So it's the whole dynamic is set up to mean sexual abuse. One of our progenitors and mentors, a man named Martin Sostra, did many, many years in the hole in New York State for refusing to be strip searched and for refusing what is no longer, I don't think, as a regular thing, which is rectal searches, where they actually go up your rectum to see if there's anything there, which is, most people don't even want that to happen at a doctor's office. But to have someone, when you're naked, have a prison guard doing that to you is rape. So it's the system is like, you know, it looks different from the inside, which is why the voices of people who've been incarcerated are so important in looking at what has to change. Because a system that's built on those things, it's not like that was an aberration. Those are the regular operating procedures. A system that's built on that, you have to ask, what is its purpose? What what is the long-term goal of that kind of treatment? What's the long-term goal of putting someone in isolation for 20 years, 30 years, and removing them from all human contact, giving them meals 3 times a day through a slot in the door and 1 hour outside in a cage that looks like a dog cage? What's the purpose of that? So I guess that's what I would say about my conclusions from my years in prison.
Yeah.
And my other conclusion is that people fight back. People don't give up. We fight back. We've just been talking about the Attica Rebellion recently in RAPP. And the Attica Rebellion was a case where people who were so badly treated got together, black, white, Latina, straight, gay, in the yard at Attica, took over D Yard and negotiated with the state to try to change conditions and try to change things. And then behind their backs, the governor of New York at that point massacred them from the air, sent in state troopers to shoot them, tortured them after the rebellion was over. And even after that level of brutality, uprisings happened in like 40 other prisons around the country afterwards because, as L.D. Barkley, one of the young black men who was in the rebellion and was killed the next day, they actually assassinated him. They retook the prison and killed a lot of people from the air, just shooting. And then they killed specific people they thought were ringleaders. And he was famous for having said, "We are men, we are not beasts, and we will not be beaten or driven as stuff, as such." And that the people will always fight for their human rights. It's what's going on in Palestine now. People who are the Israelis have killed more children in the last few days than any other country has ever killed. Just children. They're not they're not part of, they're not even, they are part of resistance in the sense that the Palestinian people have never stopped resisting the theft of their land. But people are still standing up and saying, we want our country, we want our identity, we want our homes. And I think that that was for me in prison, seeing people who were denied so many rights, so many things, still being willing to stand up and say, I am a human being and I deserve respect and treatment was really very, very inspiring to me.
Yeah. I wanted, because just, I mean, if I'm going to be honest, just hearing you, I'm a very empathetic person, so hearing these stories, I mean, I hear, my heart in its segments, it breaks, as you listen. And because I'm a Christian, the brokenness and the fallenness of man and the sin in the world and the sin in me is awful, right? It's evil, seeing what can be done. And the, one thing that has always struck me, I remember going to a Holocaust museum at one point, and they were showing us, Nazi uniforms and Nazi photos and just different things the Nazis had done. And of course, your anger gets so stirred up, and you're like, how could anyone possibly do this to anybody? And I remember the tour guide, it was the only tour guide who'd ever said this, but I thought it was so profound. He just turned around, looked at us, and he said, there's really no difference between, the Nazis and us. Like, if you just feed people the wrong information, whether that be propaganda or whatever it is, if you just tell people enough lies, they're going to believe you. And man can so quickly become as inhuman as possible. It doesn't, like, you always think you're above these terrible things that happen, and yet you are just as capable of the worst things as a lot of the people you meet around you, as much as, for him, he was saying, like, the Nazis really aren't, we think they're so egregious for what they did, and what they did was evil. But we're just as capable of doing that, depending on the situation and everything. And that really struck me because I was like, at first I was like, what? No, that can't be possible. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, you know, I, and so like you, do believe that there are things we need and have the power to do to try to make society a place where people can live in safety, a place where people can feel valued, a place where justice, forgiveness are things that reign. But at the same time, that burden that comes on me when I know how broken our world is, and that lament that you cry out of, like, why does this have to be happening? Even though we do the best we can to make the world better, and I think, even like you said before we even started recording this, Christians are even the more called to do that, right? Because Christ came to change lives, to point people to God, to treat people with humanity. And that's something that Christians are called to do, and to replicate that. And as much as I believe what you say at the same time of, like, we need to do something about this, we can't just wave our arms and say, bye, it's not my problem, it's not happening to me, doesn't matter. At the same time, I wanted to ask you, like, that burden of seeing a broken world that you have and wanting so badly to make a broken world better, which is a good and reasonable feeling and desire. I guess for me as a Christian, I'm like, okay, I know one day all that is wrong will be made right. And I know that ultimately God will make a place that is going to replicate the most ideal society ever. And so, no matter what I do, and I do my best, I know that, like, it's not up to me ultimately to make everything better. So, if I fail in this regard, if I don't do this, or if I get a no on this, or if I get beat down on this issue, ultimately good will win in this, even if I'm not the one who's going to be that person who gets that done. I mean, obviously, even when we were talking about slavery, when I was thinking of in Britain with William Wilberforce, 20, 40, I can't even remember how many years of his life that he devoted to slavery being outlawed in England. And he didn't even get that done until he was on his deathbed. Like, that's when he found out it had been done. Like, he gave his whole life for it. And then when we think about the evils of slavery in America, the Civil War, the thousands of men who died, and they never got to see the end of, slavery being, the North winning and slavery being something that was abolished. But even after then, you still had slaves. It took a while even for that to be wiped out. But you had people who would fight for this and they never got to see the end, what they'd accomplished. And I'm sorry for ranting like this, but I wanted to ask you, like, what is your hope? Because I see you fighting so hard and I see these organizations fighting so hard, and I don't think that's wrong. I think we need to be active in society. But at the same time, the burden that you must feel of just like have to make it better. Like, how do you process that? What is your um comfort? Like, you are older and you've done so much, but at the same time, one day you will die, right? You're not gonna be able to live forever, and you might not see all these goals that you really want to see. I mean, how are you comforted? Because I have the, as a Christian, I have that comfort. But I know for you, like, I'm like, how do you process that? Where is your hope and your comfort? It's like you're lamenting, you're crying out, this is wrong. I want to make it better. And I guess, I'm just curious how you process that, where your hope is.
Mhm. It's a good question. And I feel, and I think this is the hardest time I've ever lived through, watching the purposeful destruction of Palestine by our, doesn't even matter if it's our government, although that makes me more angry. I mean, even the people say, well, Hamas started it because they did this. What, in what universe does that, anything that someone did on one day, make it okay to kill hundreds of thousands, probably millions when we're done, of people that just, starve them, take away their food, all of those things? What, how does anyone justify that? So this is actually the hardest moment. I never thought I would see this kind of inhumanity. What, and this has to be our last question because I have a meeting in a minute.
I know, I'm
Uh,
sorry.
that's okay.
You're such a fascinating person to talk to.
I think what, and I've always wished, because I'm an atheist, I tried to believe in a God, and I do sort of, in the sense that, like, I don't know if you know Duke Ellington's suite that includes the song Come Sunday. Listen to it if you can. Just beautiful. It's the joint willingness of so many people who know we won't live to see the end of the evils that we're fighting against, the terror, the suffering, but who find our humanity and our joy in the act of struggling together. And I'm not sure I can explain it much more than that, other than saying that, to me, seeing people who've been so brutalized and mistreated in their lives, willing to fight with other people, to be in solidarity, to work together, to love each other. I mean, this is just a little story about a demonstration I went to a few nights ago, um, about Palestine, where my partner and I were going to go down there, and she's part of a group of writers against the war in Gaza, on Gaza. And they had said, we'll meet you at a certain spot. And she had said, well, Laura's going to have been sick, so I'm not sure Laura's going to stay very long. And she's going to, so they said, no, meet us at this spot. When we got there, the march had already, thousands of people had already stepped off. And so we found them waiting for us rather than joining. They didn't know me. They barely knew my partner, but they cared enough about supporting one another that they were willing to miss what they were there for in order to wait for us and make sure that we were like taken care of.
Hmm.
And, and at first I thought, why are you doing that? You should be marching. That's what we're here for. And then I realized, no, we're here to build our solidarity with one another, to make sure that the kind of love and caring and seeing beyond racial categories and stereotypes and anything else, seeing each other's humanity can survive this moment in history. And so I guess that's it for me, is that I just always have hope because I see people who come out of having been in roles both of being tortured and hurt and also of being the torturers and hurters who change and then band together to try to change systems and stuff. And that gives me enormous hope. So I do take a lot of like strength from movements of the past, from people who, like a dear friend of mine who died about 10 years ago, was interned in the Japanese concentration camps. I have several friends who were, I mean, they were like snatched from their lives.
Yeah.
Their, all that they had worked for was taken away, and they lived in these concentration camps. They're all human rights leaders now, fighting to end that kind of abuse for anyone else. And it's that solidarity that motivates me. To me, that is God, that ability to be suffering yourself and yet care about someone else who's suffering. So, and I would say I would love you to come to New York sometime and experience release aging people in prison. You know, we really need money, so I'm hoping you'll put our donate button on your website and encourage people to give, because we are just one of many organizations around the country who try to help people reach that point in themselves, in all of ourselves, where our own suffering is meaningful because it helps us fight to end suffering for other people. And I hope I get the sense that that's what you're interested in as well. So I really enjoyed talking to you.
I enjoyed talking to you, Laura. I'm so grateful. Thank you for sharing and blessings on your meeting. I am sorry
Thank
for
you.
holding you up.
Okay,
All right, bye, Laura.
bye. Good to meet you.
You too.